Okay, well, we still have a few people hopping on here, and I'll just go ahead and approve them as need be, but we'll go ahead and get started. My name is John Okrazik. I am Pat's digital director, and it's a pleasure to be moderating the discussion tonight. We're going to go ahead and mute everyone just so we don't have any, add inadvertent noises in the background. But just a quick rundown for what tonight will be. First, Pat is going to speak a little bit. Mayor Pete is going to speak a little bit, and then we'll have some time for discussion as well. So thank you all so much for joining us. We really appreciate the support of our campaign. We can really kind of feel the momentum of the campaign, and we're just so thrilled to be able to host this. And we want to give a special thank you to Mayor Pete for his endorsement and for supporting our campaign and agreeing to do this for us tonight. Mr. Biden has him out doing a lot of work, and so we're so grateful to have him here with us tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Pat and let her talk to you guys for a little bit. Go ahead, Pat.
Thank you, Jono, for all the work that went into this. And I want to give a special thanks to Win the Era and Mayor Pete in particular. As Jono mentioned, your endorsement really is extraordinarily important and helpful to this campaign and all this generosity of your time. So thanks for making time for all of us tonight. Thank you to all of you for participating. This is great. I know these are such anxious times and fully charged times for all of us, and tough times, and that you would take time to engage in conversation like this in pursuit of not only the preservation of our democracy, but furthering it is extraordinarily meaningful. And it's my great privilege to be with all of you tonight. I know many of you, I don't know all of you, because many of you are supporters of Pete who were thrilled to be a part of another opportunity to be in conversation with him. I do want to say a few words about why I'm running for Congress, who I am, some of the priorities in the district. I want to then turn it over to Pete. So just to begin, I know some of you know this. I want to say that I am running for Congress because I believe in dignity and justice for all, not the few. I want to say it again, can't say it enough. I'll shout it from the rooftops: dignity and justice for all, not the few. That's the core commitment of our nation, and we must reclaim that commitment, especially now in this extraordinarily challenged time, where literally the survival of our democracy is at issue. I am also running for Congress very specifically because the House of Representatives is the people's house. It's our house. And I'm not just running for any office. I'm running for the people's house to be the representative of the people of this district, because I think it's essential that we reclaim our voice and values in Washington through our representatives if our democracy is to go forward. Our founders placed the people's house, Congress, in the first article of the Constitution. We are the bedrock of our Constitution, not the executive branch, not the judiciary. The first article belongs to us, we the people. And I commit to all of you from the district who are on this, but also all of you throughout the nation who are participating tonight. I will be a representative who truly understands the role of Congress under our Constitution. It's to represent the people of this district, but also to assert our constitutional muscle, our authority, and do a good check and balance to that executive branch and the judiciary through the voice of the people. And specifically to this district, it will be my joy and my delight and my life's purpose now to bring the goodness of the people of this district to Washington. If Washington is broken, that is on us. We have not claimed our authority, no one else. It's on us, and we must reclaim our authority and our voice and values. What are those values? Hoosier hospitality, Hoosier, our work ethic, and hospitality, where all are welcome at the table. No one is left behind, no one is left out. Where we feed the hungry, we clothe the naked, we give drink to the thirsty, healthcare, and we do not abandon the imprisoned. Those are Hoosier values, American values, and they probably sound familiar to you. from other sources. They are the values of the mainline religious traditions throughout the world, and good humanists embrace them, and we need to reclaim those values. Real quickly, I've been serving this district for nearly 40 years. I came originally to study at Notre Dame. My degrees are in government and theology as undergrad, theology graduate, and law. Obviously, I love Notre Dame and what it's about, and that has shaped who I am. But also what shaped me is my roots. I have at least one of my sisters on this. Is the first time, which I love. Hello, Sarah. And I am from the Detroit area. What's important to know is that my mom and dad met when my dad returned from World War II. He was in the Navy. He returned, went to U of D Law School, met my mom. She's a pioneer, graduated in 1950. That's amazing when you look back. And then they had 7 daughters. And I'm the 5th of the 7. And because of that, I carry my father's name. By the 5th of 7, they had to use that name. So those are my roots. But why do I mention them? Because my parents taught me the importance of security. I will bring that value to your service as your representative. We need to create security and love, frankly, right? Relationship for the people of this district. And also a commitment to family and faith. And very importantly, and here we go, justice, both of my parents in the law. And I will be a bipartisan representative. My mom was an appointee to the federal bench by Ronald Reagan. So let me just be clear. There are many, many Republicans I love, not the least of which are my mother and my father. But I am a lifelong Democrat. I am a Roosevelt Democrat who believes Johnson's war on poverty is still worth fighting, and I'm a 21st century candidate. And during my years of service in the district, I have worked as an attorney, as a teacher, and I'm a small business owner. I know what it is to make payroll. I know what it is to try to provide health care. So I bring that practical experience and extensive service to the district. And it's not an either or. It's not just individual rights. It's all of us committed to one another and the common good that provides the basis for our individual rights. So finally, let me just say a couple priorities, and I want to turn it over to Pete because I know you're very anxious to hear from him. And that is that it's very clear in our district that healthcare is a priority. Everyone I speak to brings this up. Know that I will be a representative that understands that healthcare is a right, not a privilege. It is a public common good. We need healthy communities. And what COVID-19 makes clear is we had a problem with this before, that we need a healthy community and it must be available to all. So I will defend and expand the Affordable Care Act, but a movement toward universal coverage. We are way behind the other developed nations in this regard. Also, this district needs an economy that works for all of us, not just the few. And that means a redoubling down and a commitment at the federal level to getting the worker back at the table. Responsible capitalism, where sure, shareholders' interests are at play, but so are the workers. We need organized labor, workers back at the table, and recommit to the communities which those corporations and businesses serve. That's responsible capitalism, and we can renew that, and just sustainable wages. And third and finally, I've talked about this many, many times, and it's now all the more critical, a recommitment to evidence, science, and reason. I say that again, evidence, science, and reason. You will have in me a representative who will do the hard work of democracy. And what that means is I will preserve the building blocks of the law. If we lose evidence and science and reason, we lose our democracy. You see that in COVID-19, the catastrophe of the deaths and those with COVID-19 in this country, unlike the other developed nations. Don't you believe for a moment, and I don't think anybody on this Zoom call would, that this wasn't avoidable in this nation. And it's not all about China, contrary to what our current representative thinks. And responsible response to climate change. Every issue that I have mentioned, the current representative falls on the wrong side of the issue, the wrong answer. 60 times to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Tax gifts to the extremely wealthy, privatizing Social Security. gutting Medicare and Medicaid and denying evidence, science, and reason, where she proudly stands with the president's response to COVID-19 and the denial of climate change. So with that, you have a sense of who I am, I hope, what I stand for. I really want to turn this over to Pete. And again, Pete, thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Well, thanks, Pat. I'm really proud to be campaigning at your virtual side. And I got to tell you, it's a treat just to be among friends and neighbors. I guess it's a testament to the success of the virtual format, or maybe it just reflects the schedule that we kept. But by the end of last week in the Democratic National Convention, I had trouble believing that I had in fact been in South Bend that entire time. And, it feels like we're kind of all over the place, as we should be. I'm doing everything I can to make sure that we elect a new president. Matter of fact, I suppose it's perhaps unlikely, but if you happen to have Fox News on in the background, you'll see me coming on right about now, making the case for Joe Biden, because I think we got to make it to everyone and make it everywhere, or we will deserve what we get, which is having left a lot of votes behind. But I also believe it's so important not to treat the presidency like the only office that matters. We know what's at stake in bringing an end to the Trump presidency. But, as Pat said, the very first branch of government contemplated is the legislative. And it is so critically important to make sure that we build and expand a House majority that right now is the only thing holding this president in check. When you look at the COVID relief package, to take one example, the idea of having resources and funding to make sure that there were more tests was considered not the common sense measure that it is, but it was actually considered a concession to House Democrats. Might have not even been in there if House Democrats hadn't stood up for it. And that's just one example of what's at stake. Of course, the other reason I'm here is that this is close to home. I want to be represented by Pat Hackett in the United States Congress. When, from the news that the president had not paid attention to warnings about Russian bounties on my brothers and sisters in arms in Afghanistan, to the news that a friend of mine went to mail a letter down on Ironwood, across from the Martins there by where the IUSB student housing is, and found that the mailbox had a big sticker on it that said stop and was marked for removal. Those are the kind of moments that make me want to call my member of Congress. And I would if I thought it would do any good. But we know that we're not represented well in the 2nd District. And so it's great to see, so many of you that I just miss seeing around town. Steve, I miss seeing you at the gym. And I love the fact that I'm seeing folks from Team Pete and the Win the Arrow world who maybe are new to Indiana politics or haven't come to know South Bend as well and are getting to know it now. Look, ours is a district that really, I think, reflects America in so many ways. An industrial city like South Bend, rural areas, farms, racially diverse communities. We've got it all. And everybody uniquely has very personal stakes in what's about to happen in Washington. Part of why I got into politics, especially presidential politics, was out of the belief that politics fundamentally is about how our individual lives are shaped by the decisions that are made in those big white buildings. And that's true when it comes to the fact that my very marriage exists by the grace of a single vote on the U.S. Supreme Court. It exists for all of us in terms of healthcare. And the kinds of issues that Pat is squarely focused on are those kinds of concerns that really impact whether our lives are going to go well or whether they're going to be harder, whether they're going to go poorly. It's not the government decides whether we thrive or not, but what a difference good government versus poor government makes. And right now, we don't have the government that America needs or that the 2nd District deserves. You see it in the fact that our country is performing the worst in the developed world when it comes to dealing with this pandemic. You see it in the fact that we lag other countries in some of the most basic measures of literacy and human development, life expectancy, equality and equity, and of course, again, health. None of these things are immutable. These problems we're facing as a country are not the result of some cosmic force nobody can do anything about. They're the result of political decisions. There are political decisions that led to wages being as low as they are, that led to our healthcare system being the way that it is. And if we had different decisions, we would have different outcomes. And the only way to have different decisions is to have different leaders. Pat is one of those leaders. And that's why I'm so thankful that you are a part of this and generously supporting her. So I don't want to rant for too long, because I know we can have a great discussion, and I'm looking forward to that. But that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm thankful that you're here too.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor, for that. To kind of kick off the discussion, we want to start a little bit with some of the values, I think, that are so important to running a campaign. And this is for both Pat and Pete. What are some of the values that have informed your public service? Pete, why don't we start with you?
So thanks, first of all, for leading with this idea of values, because, as you know, that was a very important part of our campaign. It's an important part of the Win the Era effort too. And, you know, my political values tie back to what I consider to be human values and American values around freedom and democracy and security, but properly understood. That freedom is not just the freedom from a tax or a regulation. Freedom also means the freedom to live a life of your choosing, and you're not free if people get to tell you who you ought to marry. You're not free if you can't get the health care you need. You're not free if you work full time and live in poverty. And so these values have very real implications. It's the same thing around democracy. It used to be assumed that America was the leading democracy in the world. And yet we are struggling to be able to say that we really meet some of those basic definitions of democracy right now, with the voter suppression that's going on and the effects of everything from the Electoral College to the role of money in politics. And you don't have to be a diehard Democrat to know that those things are wrong and need to change. I believe security, properly understood, includes preserving America's security from global health threats and climate change, which is why, as Pat said, we've got to resolve questions of science and medicine by turning to scientists and doctors and seeing what they can tell us, and not stepping on them for political reasons. And, you know, it's very important and very much written into our Constitution that this country belongs to people of every religion and people of no religion. But my involvement in these pursuits is also propelled by faith values that teach the importance of looking after the most marginalized and the most vulnerable. I was astonished last night to see an entire speech delivered on the topic of faith that made no mention of humility, compassion, forgiveness, redemption, healing, poverty, or any of the other themes that, at least when I'm sitting in the pews on Sunday morning, are the ones I hear most about. We can do better than that. And if we get it right, this could actually be a unifying rather than a divisive force. So I think we ought to continue to lead with our values. And I think the kinds of values that are celebrated here in this second district are also values that call for that kind of change in leadership we're talking about.
And Pat, what about you? What are some of the values that have informed your public service?
Well, it's interesting because there's a lot of overlap for Pete and for me in this area. First of all, I want to say too, just a big shout out to our ticket. The Biden-Harris ticket in this area of values is fantastic, and we're going to retrieve in the executive branch competence and compassion in our executive branch. And I look forward to being the representative working in Congress in cooperation with the administration. I mean, the core values for me, really, one of them you've heard me talk about many times. It's the dignity and justice for all, not the few, that commitment. And I think what's important to know about that is it's based in a particular understanding of the human person, that all persons, have inherent value, are inherently good, and from my faith tradition, made in the image and likeness of God, but are absolutely good and essential and precious, and that we have to be committed to one another. And that's in the foundings of our nation. The other core value for me is the recognition that we are only fully human when we are persons of compassion, persons in right relationship with one another, to the degree, if you really lived this fully, where the concept of justice and love are one. They're not separate concepts. that justice and love are one. That was a brilliant insight, I believe, that really fueled the magnificent work of Martin Luther King Jr., who was so theologically and politically accomplished in his understanding of justice. And it certainly is consistent with what I would aspire to. And I think it's what President Obama meant when he talked about becoming a more perfect union. We become more a nation and an international community of compassion and unity, where justice and love are not separate concepts. And also, a third value of mine, or belief perhaps, is that life is purposeful, and that as a public servant, and all of us, whether you're a public servant or not, are here for a reason, have something to contribute. And what Pete was talking about in terms of freedoms and responsibilities, coupled with a good common to all. So it's very much a both and approach, not an either or. So those would be core values, core beliefs that I would take to service in Congress, and certainly have informed my work as an attorney over these years.
No, that's great. So kind of turning the discussion a little bit more towards kind of the practical, we are facing an unprecedented public health and economic crisis. How do you see the country building back better once the public health crisis, the pandemic, is actually under control? What do we need to do to kind of seize on this moment as more of an opportunity to change things rather than go back to the way that they were? Pete, let's start with you.
So I think it's a really important way to think about it. This is not about finding a way to rewind and go right back to what we were doing before, where with the same economic and political arrangements, with the same winners and the same losers, and the same weaknesses and the same injustices. Shame on us if that's all we manage to do when we recover from this pandemic, and we can't even if we try. Part of what's happened is that some of the long simmering problems and fissures in our country were exposed and also exploited by this virus. This virus spread more quickly because we're in a country that doesn't protect workers, and people were compelled to work when they probably shouldn't have. This virus spread more quickly in communities of color, largely because of the reduced access to healthcare and to workers' rights that those communities face. This virus spread more quickly in America because America wasn't at its best, and we had to learn from that. It also means we got a moment on our hands, the likes of which I don't think America's seen since perhaps the arrival of FDR in the presidency, to really be original, to be pragmatic and bold. And I think those two can go hand in hand, especially in a moment like this. Matter of fact, I don't think we can meet the moment as a practical matter unless we have a lot of imagination for solutions to get everybody healthcare, to learn the lessons of this pandemic when it comes to getting ahead of the even greater threat that climate change represents. We have a chance now to build an economy, as the vice president likes to say, build back better, so that what we come up with is more secure and more just. When we do, it's also going to be more stable. Let's remember, and I know people in our part of the country understand this, even before the pandemic, manufacturing was in a recession. Even before the pandemic, family farms were going to bankruptcy at shocking rates. And so we know that there's a better way. We know what it takes. Part of what it takes is that policies be driven by a spirit of compassion, and as well as paying attention to evidence. And those values, kind of spiritual and mathematical, add up to an opportunity to do so much better than we've done.
Pat, how do you see this moment in time, this kind of inflection point that we're at?
Well, I agree with everything that Pete just talked about. And I think it's also good where you don't repeat the history necessarily, but you can be historically informed, certainly. And I think to build back better, we have to excise, struggles that have been with this country from the beginning. We have got to address the systemic racism. We have got to address the subjugation of women and persons of sexual diversity or difference. And very importantly, really behind all of this is We have got to address the greed, which is gutting our democracy. It's absolutely gutting our democracy. It's probably the largest moral failure of the nation politically is greed. And it's really pretty simple. So one of the highest priorities I have is campaign finance reform, but also reforming the role of money in politics overall. We will not be able to accomplish any of our lofty goals if we do not address the role of money in politics. You're going to continue to repeat the same problems. And then very consistent with what Pete was saying, you know, we need a national health policy. We say once we get out of the pandemic, but first we got to get out of it, and we won't get out of it if we do not have national coherent health policy that is science and medically driven, not politically driven. But it does require a political will and a spine, and that we need to do. Also, an economy that works for all of us. We've got a great opportunity here for infrastructure rebuild, informed by the principles of addressing, you know, climate change. It's both, and we need to do that. And so there are a lot of lessons to be learned from the Roosevelt administration. You know, he had a second Bill of Rights. He had it teed up. Well, it might be time to take that swing, take that shot. And so to take a look at that and to move forward as we move forward in the 21st century. We also, specific to this district, in that economy, in addressing that, that's why I talk about workers' rights, just sustainable wages, but also our farms. We have to move and develop new markets, regional markets. We've got some extraordinary farmers here working in the whole arena of regenerative farming, you know, local regional markets. And so our farmers don't want just a handout or a subsidy. They really want the new markets. And so the federal government can incentivize that. So this is the kind, I think, of the creativity Pete's talking about, addressing and going back. Sometimes it's going back and reclaiming the best of previous practices or maybe political insights, economic principles, and then translating them and looking at what does the 21st century, the new world order vision offer us? And then let's go for it, because there is no reason the United States should be behind. No reason this magnificent district, which, as Pete mentioned, is a microcosm of the macro of the nation, shouldn't be a leader. And so we can do this. I will just say another two. One population I'm highly aware of in our district are our immigrants, is our immigrant community, our DACA participants and their families. Our farms rely on them, our manufacturing, our educational institutions. It is a scandal that we have people living in fear in this nation. All of us have come to this nation either as immigrants in the slave ship, or our land was taken from us. It's one of those three, and it's time to move toward the more perfect union with concrete political and economic policies that move us forward and to build back better. And obviously I do want to emphasize public education, public education, public education. Democracy requires an educated electorate. And one of my most recent endorsements was by the NEA, and I am so proud of that endorsement.
Yeah. So Pat, you know, you mentioned in your answer there right at the beginning, and I want to dive a little bit deeper into this, you know, about a moment of racial reckoning in our country. You know, we have the deaths of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Elijah McClain. We're seeing more protests now after what happened in Wisconsin. How do you view your role as a congresswoman, both legislatively and from a moral leadership position?
Well, the moral leadership position is we have got to be honest in our public discourse on this and change our practices and educate ourselves. Racism is very real. Systemic racism is real. It's in the very roots and beginnings of this country. And one of the biggest errors one can make is to think that this is just a past event and now we just have to move forward. It is ongoing and it's real. And obviously all of the situations that you've described show that loud and clearly. And it's a reality that people of color have known and others have known. But now that we have seen there's no excuse. And so we really, really have to commit at the federal level, state level, local, to excising racism as a part of this nation. And that's going to require investments. It's going to require legislative response, expanding the Voting Rights Act, for example, assuring equity in housing and business opportunities. Certainly also when you get into there's an intersectionality here. Something sounds distinct, but the Equal Rights Amendment, that impacts women, but particularly women of color, and so healthcare, those who are most impacted, Pete mentioned this, and not having access to healthcare, people of color. And so there's a reason why they're dying at higher numbers from COVID-19. So my response to this is we have to have a very deliberate and honest conversation that has to keep going. We have to educate around these issues. How we teach history in our public schools and schools has to be honest. And we constantly have to be educating professionals, whether it's the courts or our police agencies or all of us in the workplace, around these issues of race, address intersectionality. And then also I will be a congresswoman who will legislate from the perspective of we must move more towards that perfect union. And that gets very concrete in some of the areas I've already addressed.
Yeah, Pete, so what do you think is required at the federal level? And kind of to add on to that, how do you think we as Democrats can make the argument to people who might not believe that systemic racism is a real and kind of present danger to our country? Oh, Pete, I think we may have lost your audio there.
How about now?
There we go.
Okay. Sorry, they rigged me up with a whole complicated thing here that's a little bit above my capacities in AV to get us ready for the convention. I think part of what we've got to do is make sure that we're communicating effectively about what systemic racism is. A lot of people hear the word racism. They believe, I'm talking about white people, including white progressives. And one of the most important things a person wants to believe about themselves is that they're good. None of us can function if we don't believe we're good. And I think to many of us, the suggestion that we are in any way mixed up in systems that are racist, or that we have inhaled any of the toxins of systemic racism, is received as sort of accusation about a character flaw. And really, we've got to have a different kind of conversation that acknowledges that all of us have grown up in a very racialized society, and one that presents us with choices every day about whether the things we're doing make it worse or make it better, that aren't about whether any one of us is a good person or not, but whether we're paying attention to what's happening around us. And that means naming these issues. It means describing and explaining what it means when Black women are more likely to die related to childbirth, even when you control for income. Explaining what it means when arrest rates for nonviolent drug offenses are higher for young Black men, even when you kind of balance statistically for the rate at which Black and white people use drugs, which by the way is about the same. Issue after issue, when you look at it, there's no denying this systemic concern, but it has to be understood in a way that actually tells us what to do about it. And that's where the federal leadership comes in. Whether we're talking about questions of police accountability or questions of economic empowerment, which is a huge part of what needs to change. Even ideas like Congresswoman Barbara Lee's proposed a very interesting idea about some kind of effectively version of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission or process that will create a conversation that America needs to have with itself. And, all of these things are easier to achieve with federal leadership and federal resources. The desegregation of neighborhoods is largely something made possible through housing policy at the federal level, which is important, not least because the segregation of neighborhoods a couple of generations ago also happened largely not by accident, not by some gravitational force, because of policy choices. often federal policies, which is why we have a moral obligation to make sure that there are specific and intentional policies that change this. You can't cross out racist policies, delete them after generations, and then replace them with neutral ones and expect everything to get better. And it's not going to be easy. We've, as you know, had mighty struggles with this here in South Bend, whether it's racial justice in policing or housing or economic empowerment or any other area. But what I know is that there needs to be a partnership between local decision makers and federal leaders. And having the right people in the right seats in Congress is a huge part of what that's going to take.
Absolutely. Well, Pete, that actually really plays into a question that I think you're very well suited to answer, that Pat will be well suited to answer as the next Congresswoman in the district. And a question from Julia King. She said, I love seeing a partnership between a former mayor and a congressional candidate. Can you speak a little bit about the ways that local governance depends on good national governance? Often voters compartmentalize, seeing local government as very removed from Washington. How do you help connect the thread of government at all levels? Pete, what do you think about that?
So let me be honest, in my early days as mayor, I actually cherished the fact that I didn't have to deal with national politics or partisan politics that much. You know, on the council here, if you're local, you know what I'm talking about. You know, there were ferocious politics, but they weren't necessarily predictable along party lines. Sometimes a Democrat could be one of my most difficult legislators, and sometimes a Republican could be an ally, and it wasn't, and 2 weeks later, the reverse might be true. And I really valued that because we're so close to the ground and not everything is wrapped up in some of these national political trends. But what I found over time was that everything we do locally ultimately is part of the bigger picture. And it is either harder or easier for mayors to do their job. And I talk to mayors all the time about this. Just as I know we have at least one education leader here. I think I saw Rudy Monterosa on the call. You know, educators, something as exquisitely local as how a school district is run, it depends hugely on what's coming out of Washington. First of all, in terms of resources, of course, and where those resources are directed, but also just in terms of priorities. For example, when we were first going through challenges around policing and racial justice here in South Bend, under the Obama administration, I could call the White House and get connected with a 21st century policing task force, Department of Justice that would work really hand in hand with us to try to make sure we were advancing. When this current administration took office, the only time I ever heard from the Justice Department on the subject of policing was when they sent a letter threatening our police fund, our grant funding, unless I promised to comply with, basically enlist our police in helping them do their immigration enforcement for them. And needless to say, with excellent legal support here in South Bend, we sent that letter back with a whole bunch of red lines through it and got what we needed to for the people of South Bend. But it would have been nice to be able to do that with my member of Congress sitting at our side, speaking to that connection between the federal policy and the executive branch and the local needs here on the ground. That's what we would have with Pat in that office. So, and that's only more true now. Look, all of these local concerns are shaped by leadership, not just at the policy level, but also at the tonal level. It is just plain harder to bring people together in a country with leadership as divisive as we have today. And that tone is so important. Those priorities are so important. And it's why that campaign message that Pat has of dignity and justice for all really resonates with me.
Pat, how do you see that tonal responsibility as a congresswoman?
Well, I think Pete's answer was great. And I do see these relationships as partnerships. And, you know, there's a bully pulpit in any public office. And I think that has to be used well. Specific to the working with the local, let's say the city governance and national, one thing that's very important that I'll take very seriously is the oversight role that Congress plays. Different agencies which deeply touch the quality and character of local life. This current administration has just gutted the agencies. If you take a look at all of the appointments to the cabinet, the people were specifically selected because they don't believe in the agency. They were selected to lead. It was that insidious. It wasn't just a difference in emphasis. They literally do not believe in that. EPA is just one example. Education is another. So one of the ways as a congresswoman I can serve the local government, municipal government, is to take very seriously that oversight role. So rather than just waiting for problems to land in the lap, let's say, of what Pete was describing, of the mayor, and you're responding and they're responding, we see that as the congresswoman, I would see the problem at the national level, see what's happening in other communities, and hold the agencies to account in our oversight role. Call out, irresponsible practices, violations of the law, especially when they have to do with the health and well-being of local communities. So I think that's one critical way. Besides the power of the purse, we can have all sorts of, we can incentivize at the federal level good local practices and give the resources necessary to achieve good purposes that many, I think, of our mayors and local governments want to pursue, but simply don't have the economic resources to make that happen. So joint initiatives and incentivize those through the power of the purse, I think, is very important. So those would be two areas I can help improve the local quality of life. And then the other is just be a representative who's present, be in communication. Right now we have a representative who's not in the district and is not showing up for votes, not quite sure what she's doing, but I'll be there working collaboratively with our local governments throughout our 10-county district.
No, absolutely. So this is a question from Kurt Seifert. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He says, should we win the vote in November, how do you begin to how do you begin to knit our terribly wounded nation back together with the corruption that Trump has spread throughout the government? I think that's a really, important topic that is going to have lasting implications on the federal government, on how checks and balances actually work. So Pat, how do you view that issue of corruption? How do you view, rooting that out and restoring some kind of moral righteousness to the federal government?
Well, we need a great big blue wave to wash it out. Let's just, you hear the song, "Wash That Man Right Out of My Hair." Well, this is wash the whole corruption right out with a big blue wave. And it's not that Democrats are immune from corruption. I'm not suggesting that. But right now, there's something particularly insidious and radically wrong with the Trump administration and those who enable this administration that don't represent the best of Republican values. So I think a value-based approach to governance is one thing. I think it's why I emphasize campaign finance reform, not just how you get elected, but then also reform in the legislative process itself. And that's going to be a tough course because it requires a constitutional amendment. I'm not a big, I'm not into tinkering with the Constitution, but two of the areas where I say we need to do this is the Equal Rights Amendment and campaign finance reform, reverse the just damaging effects of Citizens United and related laws. We also have to have a renewed, we desperately need a renewed Department of Justice specifically. William Barr is a disaster and has caused great harm to this nation and the rule of law. And but with the right person in that position, we can absolutely retrieve our commitment to the rule of law and the critical role that that particular office plays in preserving accountability under the law and the federal prosecutions that would be necessary and oversight to clean up the corruption in governance. And obviously renewed Office of Inspector General and all sorts of ethics offices. We also, one other final point, we have to take a hard look. One of the things that I've learned in through this administration is so much of what we do in our democracy just relies on norms, good behaviors. And we haven't had to confront such extraordinary international corruption that this administration has brought. We learned a hard lesson. So we're going to, one of the things I would look to do as a member of Congress is actually legislate, codify, have laws requiring correct practices, and don't just rely on norms anymore. because we've learned the hard way what someone with no moral compass can get away with. And it's not just someone, it's that person surrounding themselves and enabled by persons of a shared perspective.
Yeah, Pete, how do we get rid of corruption going forward in your mind? And then to loop in a question from Paula Riddell, how do we also convince Americans to trust their government again if we're successful in that?
Yeah, so I've actually just written a book on the subject. It'll come out in early October, entitled Trust, and I'm part of a community of scholars at the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Studies studying trust as our topic or theme for the year. It's a hugely important issue. You know, distrust of our institutions, partly because we've witnessed policy failure, partly because there's an ideological project to undermine trust in institutions, even by the people running them, which is certainly true right now, partly because of foreign efforts deliberately targeted toward undermining our trust. All of this has added up to a very dangerous situation where even basic things like, for example, the percentage of Americans saying that they would expect to get a coronavirus vaccine once one was invented, dangerously low, largely as a consequence of mistrust. And so we've got to build that back up. And I think the solutions are very much the ones Pat was just talking about: constitutional, legal, political. So constitutional, you know, making sure that there are, for example, common sense boundaries around the way that money can be allowed to flow into politics. Legal, you know, we have to create the right kind of boundaries. And by the way, just establish levels of transparency. Nobody thought you had to have a law saying the president would release their tax returns, because they all just did anyway. I did. And I promise you, there's nothing very interesting in there. You can look them up. But even candidates would. It's just a norm. But, you know, we probably actually need to codify that, because we've discovered that it's actually possible for a president not to take that norm seriously. But I think the biggest thing actually is political. And what I mean by that is, if, for example, a rather conservative district like ours votes for a Democratic candidate right now, because we're all so fed up with the way things are going, that sends the kind of shockwave powerful enough even to unite those politically surviving Republicans with their own conscience, because a lot of them deep down know this is wrong just as well as we do. And that's one of the reasons I'd be so thrilled to celebrate our victory here in the 2nd District on election night.
Yeah, absolutely. Pat, what do you hope to see in the district in the coming years? What do you think are the top priorities?
Well, first of all, I hope to see a real representative for this district. One representative who shows up. And we have a current representative who she's not had a town hall since 2013. I've had more town halls than Jackie has just in the course of running in the midterms and now. So one who shows up, who can listen, but then also, if you look at Jackie's record, who shows up in the floor of Congress and makes the hard votes, but makes the votes based on a litmus test of the well-being of the people of this district and the nation, dignity and justice for all, not outside corporate interests. So what I hope for this district is, I mean, I deeply, deeply believe everything we've talked about, and we will not have a healthy, vibrant district if we do not have a real representative. And that's why I'm running. And so that's one of my hopes. And then other than that, I think it's things we've already talked about. We need a healthy district, and we've talked about health policies that can promote that. We need an economically vibrant district with an economy that really serves all the people. You know, I will say to you, I see a stark difference, even in the short time from when I had the privilege of traveling the district when I ran in the midterms to now. Many people who I think would have considered themselves middle class, even just a couple years ago, are now the working poor. This is a precipitous decline, and this was before COVID-19. Now we've fallen off the economic cliff. And so there are definitely things we can do, but an economically vibrant manufacturing, vibrancy, our farm communities vibrant, you know, urban and rural, and our diverse community. So those would be the things that I would hope for, and these are the things that I would promote.
Yeah, Pete, what gives you hope on November 3rd? What gives you hope for then and for the years to come?
So a few things. First of all, the people I've interacted with who are hardcore Democrats, independents, Republicans. Some of the places we did best in my campaign were counties in Iowa that had swung 20, 30 points, had voted for Barack Obama, then voted for Donald Trump, and now we're ready for change. And so I've seen how humanity can cut across some of these hardened political lines. Working with great candidates running for office gives me tremendous hope. And you should just see the range of the candidates alongside Pat that we're backing with Win the Era, folks at every level and in every part of the country who really demonstrate, I think, what a new wave of leadership could bring. I draw hope from the fact that this country is capable of great change in not a lot of time. Sometimes it's far from guaranteed, but it can happen. Some of those changes changed my life. I have every confidence that America can get through this, but I also believe we're living through the most pivotal time. It almost defies description without falling back onto some kind of cliche. Pick your metaphor, fork in the road, edge of a cliff, you name it, turning point, inflection point, we're here. But I think the 2020s could go down in history as one of those decades that just shapes American life for an entire era. And the beginning of the 2020s hasn't gone too hot for us. 2020 has been rough, but we get to decide how 2020 ends, and it could end with an election that sets the tone for a better decade, and in turn, a better American life for as long as I'm around.
Pat, I'll turn it over to you for the last word. What gives you hope leading up to Election Day, and how can people get involved and help out with the campaign?
Well, I have great hope just seeing an evening like this tremendous participation and the dedication of people really working hard, not only to save our democracy, but to further it. That gives me profound hope. Fantastic candidates. The candidates who ran for president on the Democratic side, our resulting ticket is a fantastic ticket. It gives me great hope. Here's one thing specific to myself. Where does my hope, I'm going to say, where's my hope come from? In terms of winning, I like to say I played basketball. I'm a point guard. A point guard turns the game around, takes the three-point shot when it's necessary, can just completely change that game and go in a new direction. Jackie, she's sort of a lumbering forward, maybe, and that, if you're going to put your money on one or the other, my hope comes from the fact that I'm a point guard and I understand what we need to do in this district, in this nation. And, as a point guard, I relish that challenge. And so my hope comes from that as well, but mostly from the good people of this district, extraordinary acts of kindness and courage. And so with respect to the campaign, any of you who are interested in supporting this campaign, Jackie has corporate PAC money. We desperately need investments in the campaign. We have to get our message out to be on TV and paid media. So please go to pathackett4congress.com. You've already contributed to be here. We're so deeply grateful. I do not make that ask lightly. I know these are challenged times and appreciate your generosity. No amount is too small. If you want to volunteer on the campaign, go to our website and sign up. We've got lots of ways to do this safely from your home. So again, I want to thank all of you for being here with us, and especially Pete for the generosity of your time with all that's going on right now nationally and politically. So thank you so much, Pete. Thank you to all of you.
Great. Thank you to everyone. We really appreciate your support. Thank you guys so much.
Keep up the great work. Take care. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Good night, all.